A debt finally paid. London, 1918. Rose Kensington visited Captain Thomas Sinclair's grave every Sunday. But today, as she traced his name, she noticed something new beneath it. Another set of initials had been carved overnight.
Edka.
Her own. Chapter 1. The name that appeared in stone. The damp chill of the late October morning seeped through Rose Kensington's worn wool coat, settling deep into her bones. A thin mist, typical of London in autumn, clung to everything, blurring the edges of the headstones in the quiet churchyard. St. Michael's, nestled in a surprisingly tranquil corner of the bustling city, had become her sanctuary. Every Sunday, for the past 2 years, she had come here, drawn by a grief that had taken root in her soul and refused to be uprooted. Today, like every Sunday, she knelt before the granite headstone, its polished surface reflecting the gray sky like a dull mirror. Captain Thomas Sinclair. Beloved son, loyal friend, brave soldier. The inscription, stark and final, always brought a fresh wave of sorrow. She traced the letters of his name with a gloved finger, the cold stone a tangible reminder of the life that had been cruelly snatched away. Thomas. The name echoed in her mind, a whisper of laughter, a shared glance across a crowded ballroom, the warmth of his hand in hers on a summer evening long ago. Memories, once vibrant and full of life, were now fading at the edges, like a cherished photograph worn thin with time. The war had taken more than just lives, it had stolen futures, dreams, and the very essence of who they were. She had brought a small posy of late-blooming chrysanthemums, their bronze and gold petals a splash of defiant color against the somber grayness. Arranging them in the small vase embedded in the stone, Rose noticed something different. Something that sent a shiver of unease down her spine, separate from the autumn chill. Beneath Thomas's name, freshly carved into the granite, were 2 initials. R.K. Her own initials. Rose blinked, her heart skipping a beat. She leaned closer, her breath clouding in the cold air. The carving was undeniably new, the raw edges of the stone were still sharp, the dust of the work clinging to the crevices. It wasn't a trick of the light, or a figment of her grief-addled imagination. Someone had deliberately, and very recently, added her initials to Thomas's grave. A wave of dizziness washed over her. It felt wrong. A desecration, not just of Thomas's resting place, but of her own life. She was still living, breathing, even if a part of her felt as cold and lifeless as the stone beneath her fingers. This felt like a premonition, a dark omen in a world already steeped in darkness. She ran a trembling hand over the RK, trying to understand. Who would do this?
And why?
Was it a cruel prank? A message? A threat? The possibilities swirled in her mind, each more unsettling than the last. The churchyard, usually a place of quiet contemplation, suddenly felt menacing. The rustling of the wind in the ancient yew trees sounded like whispered secrets, the shadows stretching long and distorted across the grass. She looked around, half expecting to see someone watching her, lurking among the graves. But the churchyard was deserted, save for a lone blackbird perched on a nearby headstone, its beady eyes fixed on her. Rose was not a woman easily frightened. The war had seen to that. She had worked tirelessly as a volunteer nurse at St. Bartholomew's Hospital, tending to the endless stream of wounded soldiers returning from the front. She had seen horrors that would haunt her nightmares for years to come, had held the hands of dying men, had witnessed the raw, brutal reality of war firsthand. But this was different. This was personal. She thought of the endless stream of casualties, the names read aloud in church each Sunday, the growing list of the fallen. It was a world where death was commonplace, where lives were extinguished like flickering candles in a storm. But this felt deliberate, a pointed finger aimed directly at her. She tried to rationalize it. Perhaps it was a mistake. A stonemason with a morbid sense of humor, or a case of mistaken identity. But deep down, she knew it was more than that. The precision of the carving, the deliberate placement beneath Thomas's name, it was a message, clear and chilling. Rose had always believed in signs, in the subtle whispers of the universe. Her grandmother, a woman steeped in the old ways, had taught her to pay attention to the unspoken, to the currents that flowed beneath the surface of everyday life. And this was a sign she couldn't ignore. She remembered a conversation with Thomas, just weeks before he left for the front. They had been sitting by the Serpentine in Hyde Park, watching the swans glide across the water. He had spoken of his fears, not of death itself, but of being forgotten, of his life being reduced to a name on a list. She had promised him then, with all the fierce conviction of young love, that she would never forget him, that she would keep his memory alive. And now, someone was linking her name to his in death. A sudden gust of wind whipped through the churchyard, scattering the fallen leaves and sending a shiver through Rose. She pulled her coat tighter around her, feeling a knot of fear tighten in her stomach. She knew, with a certainty that defied logic, that this was not the end. This was the beginning of something. Something that would force her to confront not only the lingering grief of Thomas's death, but a new and far more unsettling mystery. She stood, her legs shaky, and looked once more at the carved initials.
Edka.
A silent promise, or a chilling threat. Only time would tell. Chapter 2. Whispers in the Churchyard. The walk back to her small flat in Bloomsbury felt longer than usual. Rose's mind raced, replaying the unsettling discovery in the churchyard. The initials, RK, etched beneath Thomas's name, felt like a brand, marking her in some unseen way. The usual London bustled a rumble of motorbuses. The cries of street vendors, the chatter of passers-by seemed muffled, distant, as if she were walking through a thick fog. She tried to focus on the familiar sights, the bookshops with their enticing displays, the flower stalls overflowing with vibrant blooms, the comforting aroma of freshly baked bread wafting from a nearby bakery. These were the anchors of her everyday life, the small comforts that had helped her navigate the darkness of the war years. But today, even these familiar landmarks offered no solace. Her flat, usually a haven of peace and quiet, felt strangely oppressive. The silence, broken only by the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway, seemed to amplify her unease. She lit a small fire in the grate, hoping the warmth would dispel the chill that had settled in her bones, but the flickering flames only cast dancing shadows on the walls, adding to her sense of disquiet. She made herself a cup of strong tea, the familiar ritual a small comfort in the face of the unknown. As she sat by the window, sipping the hot liquid, she replayed the events of the morning. Who could have carved those initials?
And why?
Her circle of friends was small, mostly fellow nurses and volunteers from the hospital. She couldn't imagine any of them doing something so cruel. Her family, what little remained of it, was scattered across the country, caught up in their own wartime struggles. Her parents were deceased, and her only brother, Edward, was serving with the Royal Flying Corps, his whereabouts often unknown. Could it be a message from Edward? A coded warning, perhaps? He was involved in intelligence work, she knew, though the details were shrouded in secrecy. But why use Thomas's grave? It seemed unnecessarily risky and deeply disrespectful. She considered the possibility of a stranger, someone connected to Thomas, perhaps a fellow soldier or a distant relative. But she had met most of Thomas's family, and she couldn't recall anyone with the initials RK. The thought that it might be someone she didn't know, someone lurking in the shadows, was even more unsettling. As the afternoon wore on, Rose decided she couldn't stay cooped up in her flat any longer. The silence was suffocating, the unanswered questions gnawing at her. She needed to talk to someone, to share her burden, even if she couldn't fully explain the sense of dread that had settled over her. She decided to visit Mrs. Davies, the elderly widow who lived in the flat below. Mrs. Davies was a kind, perceptive woman, a font of local knowledge, and a comforting presence in Rose's life. She had lost her own son in the early days of the war, and the two women had formed a bond of shared grief and resilience. Mrs. Davies greeted her with a warm smile, her wrinkled face lighting up with genuine affection. "Rose, dear, come in, come in. You look a bit pale. Have you had a fright?" Rose hesitated, unsure how to explain her discovery without sounding melodramatic. I saw something unsettling at the churchyard today, she began, her voice trembling slightly. Mrs. Davies led her to a comfortable armchair by the fire, her eyes filled with concern. Tell me everything, dear. Don't keep it bottled up. Rose recounted her visit to Thomas's grave, the discovery of the initials, the feeling of unease that had washed over her. Mrs. Davies listened patiently, her hand resting gently on Rose's arm. When Rose had finished, Mrs. Davies was silent for a moment, her brow furrowed in thought. That is strange, dear, she said finally. Very strange indeed. I've lived in this neighborhood for over 50 years, and I've never heard of anything like that happening before. I don't know what to think, Mrs. Davies, Rose said, her voice filled with despair. It feels like a warning or a threat. Mrs. Davies patted her hand reassuringly. Now, dear, don't jump to conclusions. It could be a mistake, a prank, or something else entirely. But what else could it be? Rose asked, her eyes searching Mrs. Davies' face for answers. Mrs. Davies hesitated, her gaze shifting towards the window. There are whispers, dear, she said softly. Whispers of things that happen in the shadows, things that most people don't see. What kind of whispers? Rose asked, her heart quickening. Mrs. Davies leaned closer, her voice barely above a whisper. Whispers of secret societies, of spies and informants, of people who disappear, of messages left in unusual places. She paused, her gaze meeting Rose's. This war, it's changed things, dear. It's brought out the best in some people and the worst in others. Rose felt a chill run down her spine. Mrs. Davies' words echoed her own growing sense of unease. The war had created a world of secrets and shadows, where the lines between friend and foe were blurred, and where danger lurked around every corner. Do you think it could be something like that? Rose asked, her voice trembling. Mrs. Davies shrugged, her expression unreadable. I don't know, dear. But I do know that you need to be careful. And you need to find out who carved those initials and why. She looked at Rose, her eyes filled with a mixture of concern and determination. Perhaps, she murmured, more to herself than Rose, we should start by asking Mr. Abernathy. Rose looked at her, puzzled. Mr. Abernathy? The stonemason? Mrs. Davies nodded. He's the one who carved Thomas's headstone, isn't he? He might know something. He sees everyone who comes and goes in that churchyard. A flicker of something hope, perhaps, sparked within Rose. Maybe there was a logical explanation after all. Maybe Mr. Abernathy held the key. Chapter 3. The Letter from Nowhere. The next morning, a thick fog shrouded London, even denser than the day before. It felt as if the city itself were holding its breath, mirroring the apprehension that clung to Rose. The visit to Mrs. Davies had provided a sliver of direction, a potential lead, but it had also amplified the unsettling feeling that she was stepping into something far more complex than a simple prank. Rose found Mr. Abernathy's workshop tucked away on a narrow side street, not far from the churchyard. The air was thick with the scent of stone dust and the rhythmic clang of hammer against chisel. The workshop was a dimly lit cavern filled with half-finished monuments, angels with broken wings, and crosses of varying sizes. Mr. Abernathy himself was a small, wiry man with hands roughened by years of working with stone. He looked up from his work as Rose entered, his eyes, magnified by thick spectacles, peering at her with curiosity. "Can I help you, miss?" he asked, his voice raspy, like stone grinding against stone. Rose explained her visit, describing the initials carved on Thomas's headstone. Mr. Abernathy listened intently, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Sinclair, you say?" he repeated, stroking his chin. "Yes, I remember that one. A fine young man, they said. Terrible shame, this war. Did you carve the initials RK beneath his name?" Rose asked, her voice hesitant. Mr. Abernathy shook his head slowly. "No, miss. I did not. I haven't been back to that stone since I set it 2 years ago." He paused, his eyes narrowing. "Someone's been tampering with my work, then. That's not right. Not right at all." He led Rose to a large, dusty ledger, its pages filled with meticulous records of his work. He ran a finger down the entries, stopping at Thomas Sinclair's name. Here it is. Captain Thomas Sinclair. Installed October 1916. No mention of any alterations. Rose felt a wave of disappointment. She had hoped Mr. Abernathy would have a simple explanation, but his denial only deepened the mystery. Do you recognize the initials? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper.
Erka.
Do they mean anything to you? Mr. Abernathy shook his head again.
Can't say they do, miss.
I see a lot of names, a lot of initials. They all blur together after a while. He paused, looking at Rose with a mixture of sympathy and concern. You think it's connected to something, do you? Rose hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. I don't know, she admitted. But it feels wrong. Like a message or a warning. Mr. Abernathy nodded slowly. I understand, miss. This war, it's made the world a strange place. People do things, desperate things. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a knowing sadness. You be careful, miss. There are hidden things that are best left undisturbed. His words echoed Mrs. Davies' warning, sending a shiver down Rose's spine. She thanked Mr. Abernathy for his time and left the workshop, feeling more lost and confused than ever. As she walked back towards her flat, the fog began to lift, revealing patches of pale blue sky. The sun, a weak, watery disk, cast long shadows on the pavement. She was about to turn the corner onto her street when she noticed a small, crumpled envelope lying on the ground, half hidden beneath a pile of fallen leaves. It was addressed in a spidery, unfamiliar handwriting, simply to R.K. Rose's heart skipped a beat. She looked around, but the street was deserted. She picked up the envelope, her hands trembling. It was sealed, but there was no return address. She hesitated, her mind racing. Should she open it? Was it a trap? A message from the person who had carved the initials on Thomas's grave? Curiosity and a growing sense of urgency overcame her fear. She slipped the envelope into her pocket and hurried back to her flat. Once inside, she locked the door and drew the curtains, shutting out the outside world. She sat down at her small writing desk, her hands still trembling. She carefully opened the envelope, revealing a single sheet of paper, folded in thirds. The message, written in the same spidery handwriting as the address, was brief and cryptic. Meet me at the Whispering Gallery, St. Paul's Cathedral, tomorrow at noon. He watches. It was unsigned. Rose read the message again and again, her mind reeling. The Whispering Gallery. St. Paul's Cathedral. A place of echoes and secrets. He watches. Who was he? And what did it all mean? The letter, instead of providing answers, had only deepened the mystery, drawing her further into a web of intrigue and danger. But it had also given her a lead, a place to start. She knew, with a certainty that defied logic, that she had to go to St. Paul's. She had to find out who had sent the letter and what they wanted. It was a risk, a dangerous gamble, but she felt she had no choice. Her own initials, appearing on a gravestone, and a mysterious letter tied her to this, whether she liked it or not. Chapter 4. Echoes of a Lost Love. The vastness of St. Paul's Cathedral, even amidst the hushed whispers of wartime London, was almost overwhelming. Sunlight streamed through the high, arched windows, illuminating swirling dust motes in the air, creating an ethereal, almost otherworldly atmosphere. Rose, having arrived early, stood near the entrance, her heart pounding a nervous rhythm against her ribs. The sheer scale of the building, a monument to faith and resilience, seemed to amplify the weight of her own anxieties. She had spent a restless night. The cryptic message, meet me at the Whispering Gallery, tomorrow at noon. He watches. Playing on repeat in her mind. The anonymity of the sender, the ominous warning, the choice of such a public, yet strangely intimate, location, it all pointed to something clandestine, something potentially dangerous. She had considered not coming, telling herself it was a foolish risk, a trap. But the initials, R.K., on both the gravestone and the letter, were a tether, pulling her forward. This was about Thomas, about her, about a connection that felt both profound and deeply unsettling. The Whispering Gallery, a circular walkway high above the cathedral floor, was famous for its acoustic properties. A whisper spoken against one wall could be heard clearly on the opposite side, a phenomenon that had fascinated visitors for centuries. It was a place of secrets, of shared confidences, of hidden messages. As the clock neared noon, Rose began to ascend the winding staircase, her footsteps echoing in the vast silence. The air grew cooler, the sounds of the city fading below. Reaching the gallery, she found herself alone. The circular walkway was empty, bathed in the soft, diffused light filtering through the dome above. She leaned against the curved wall, her gaze sweeping across the vast expanse of the cathedral floor below. Tiny figures moved like ants, their voices a distant murmur. She felt a sense of isolation, of vulnerability, exposed in this high, open space. The minutes ticked by, each one stretching into an eternity. Rose began to doubt herself, to wonder if she had been foolish to come. Perhaps it was all a hoax, a cruel joke played by someone who knew of her grief, of her connection to Thomas. Then she heard it, a faint whisper, seemingly coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. Rose? The voice was soft, hesitant, yet undeniably familiar. It sent a shiver down her spine, a jolt of recognition that bypassed her conscious mind and went straight to her heart. She turned, her eyes scanning the gallery. At first she saw no one. Then, a figure emerged from the shadows on the opposite side of the walkway. A man in a dark coat, his face obscured by the dim light. As he drew closer, Rose's breath caught in her throat. Her heart, which had been pounding with fear, now seemed to stop altogether. It couldn't be, but it was. The man stopped a few feet away, his face still partially hidden in shadow. He was taller than she remembered, thinner, his face bearing the lines of hardship and suffering. But the eyes were unmistakable. "Thomas?" she whispered, her voice barely audible, even in the stillness of the gallery. The man nodded slowly, a flicker of a smile touching his lips. "It's me, Rose." A wave of dizziness washed over her. She reached out, her hand grasping the cold stone wall for support. It was impossible. Thomas was dead. She had seen his grave, his name carved in stone.
But how?
She stammered, her mind struggling to reconcile what she was seeing with what she knew to be true. Thomas, or the man who appeared to be Thomas, stepped closer, his face now fully illuminated by the light. The resemblance was uncanny. It was Thomas, and yet not. There was a weariness in his eyes, a haunted look that she had never seen before. "It's a long story, Rose," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "A story that I can't fully explain. Not here, not now." But the grave your name, Rose struggled to find the words, her mind a whirlwind of confusion and disbelief. "A necessary deception," Thomas said, his gaze meeting hers. "To protect me, to protect you."
Protect me?
"From what?" "From the people who are watching," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "The people who know who I am, what I've done." Rose remembered the cryptic message. "He watches." She had assumed it referred to a single person, a shadowy figure lurking in the background. But now she realized it could mean something far more sinister. "I don't understand," she said, her voice trembling. "What's happening? Why are you here?" Thomas reached out, his hand gently touching her cheek. The touch, so familiar, yet so unexpected, sent a wave of warmth through her, a spark of hope in the midst of the overwhelming confusion. "I came back for you, Rose," he said, his voice filled with a tenderness that she had thought lost forever. "I had to see you, to make sure you were safe." He looked around, his gaze sweeping the gallery. "But we can't talk here. It's not safe." He took her hand, his grip firm and reassuring. "Come with me," he said. "I'll explain everything. But we have to hurry." He led her towards the staircase, his pace quickening. Rose followed, her mind still reeling, her heart torn between disbelief and a fragile, burgeoning hope. She didn't know where they were going or what awaited them, but she knew one thing. She had to trust him. The man she had loved, The man she had mourned was alive, and he was in danger. And somehow, she was caught in the middle of it all. Chapter 5. The Secret of the Carving. Their escape from St. Paul's was a blur of hurried steps and hushed whispers. Thomas, his senses seemingly heightened, guided Rose through the throngs of people, his hand firmly clasped in hers, a lifeline in a sea of uncertainty. They emerged into the bustling streets, the noise and chaos of London a stark contrast to the hushed sanctity of the cathedral. He led her through a maze of narrow alleyways and side streets, his pace relentless, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. Rose, struggling to keep up, felt a growing sense of unease. The Thomas she remembered had been a man of open smiles and easy laughter, a man who had faced the world with unwavering optimism. This Thomas was different, hardened, secretive, his every movement radiating a sense of urgency and danger. Finally, they reached a nondescript building in a quiet, residential street. It looked like any other row house, its facade unremarkable, its windows dark and uninviting. Thomas produced a key, unlocked the door, and ushered her inside. The interior was sparsely furnished, almost Spartan. A single, bare light bulb illuminated a small living room, furnished with a worn sofa, a rickety table, and two mismatched chairs. The air was stale, unused, as if the room had been left vacant for a long time. Thomas locked the door behind them and drew the curtains, shutting out the outside world. He turned to Rose, his face etched with a mixture of exhaustion and relief. "We're safe here for now," he said, his voice low. Rose sank onto the sofa, her legs trembling. "Thomas," she began, her voice shaking, "please tell me what's going on. I don't understand any of this." He sat down beside her, his gaze meeting hers. "I know it's a lot to take in, Rose. And I'm sorry for putting you through this. But I had no choice." He paused, taking a deep breath. "The truth is, Rose, I'm not who you think I am. Or rather, I'm not just who you think I am." Rose frowned, her confusion deepening. "What do you mean?" "My name is Thomas Sinclair," he said, "that much is true. But I'm not just a soldier. I'm an intelligence operative. I work for a secret branch of the government, gathering information, infiltrating enemy networks." Rose stared at him, her mind struggling to grasp the implications of his words.
A spy?
She whispered. Thomas nodded. "Essentially, yes. But the warrior death, it was all staged, Rose," he explained. "A carefully orchestrated deception. My mission required me to disappear, to become someone else."
But why?
"Why you?" "I was chosen because of my background," he said, his voice hesitant. "My knowledge of languages, my connections. I was the perfect candidate for a highly sensitive mission, one that required me to infiltrate the highest levels of the German command." He explained how he had spent the past 2 years living under an assumed identity, gathering information, passing it on to his superiors. It was a dangerous game, a constant tightrope walk between discovery and survival. "But why the grave? Why my initials?" Rose asked, the pieces of the puzzle slowly starting to fit together. Thomas reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, tarnished silver locket. He opened it, revealing a miniature portrait of Rose, her face young and radiant, a ghost of the past. "This," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "is what kept me going. The thought of you, the hope of seeing you again." He paused, his gaze meeting hers. "The initials on the grave, it was a message. A way of letting me know that you were still waiting, that you hadn't forgotten me. But I put flowers on the grave every week." Rose pointed out. He shook his head, "Not that.
Edka.
Those initials were placed by my contact. It was Dada's signal.
To tell me it was safe to reach out. To contact you."
Rose felt a wave of relief wash over her. The unsettling mystery of the carving, the fear and confusion it had caused, now had a rational explanation. It wasn't a threat, but a sign, a desperate attempt by Thomas to reconnect with her. But still another question, burning and persistent, remained. But who put the initials there? If not the stonemason, and not you, then who? The question hung in the air. Thomas's expression turned guarded, and a deep, unreadable sadness settled over him. Chapter 6. Among the walking wounded. Thomas hesitated, his gaze shifting away from Rose, his jaw tightening. The answer to her question, it seemed, was not one he was eager to reveal. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken emotions, the weight of secrets yet to be shared. The person who carved the initials, he said finally, his voice low and strained, is someone I work with. Someone I trust. Or at least someone I thought I could trust. Rose frowned. What do you mean? He turned back to her, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and doubt. Her name is Rebecca Kincaid. She's also an intelligence operative. She's been my contact, my liaison with headquarters. She's the one who arranged for the deception, the grave. She's the one who's been keeping me informed about you. Rose felt a jolt, a strange mixture of relief and something else. Jealousy? Resentment? It was irrational, she knew, but the image of another woman, a woman who shared Thomas's secret world, a woman who knew him in ways she couldn't, it stung. Rebecca Kincaid, Rose repeated, the name tasting foreign and unfamiliar on her tongue. And she carved the initials? Thomas nodded. She's the only one who knew about the signal, about the locket. She's the only one who could have done it.
But why?
Rose asked. Why would she do it now? After all this time? Thomas ran a hand through his hair, his expression troubled. That's what I don't understand. It doesn't make sense. The timing, it's all wrong. We were supposed to wait until the war was over, until it was safe to resurface. He explained that his mission was nearing its end, that he was on the verge of uncovering a crucial piece of information that could significantly impact the outcome of the war. He was supposed to remain hidden, anonymous, until the time was right. Rebecca's actions, the premature signal, had jeopardized everything. I don't understand her motives, he said, his voice filled with frustration. It's like she's gone rogue. Or she's been compromised. The thought that Rebecca, the woman who held Thomas's life in her hands, might be working against him, sent a chill down Rose's spine. It added another layer of danger, another layer of uncertainty, to an already precarious situation. What are we going to do? Rose asked, her voice trembling. Thomas looked at her, his eyes filled with a steely determination. We need to find her. We need to find out what she's up to, who she's working for. And we need to do it before it's too late. He stood up, his movements purposeful. We can't stay here. It's too risky. We need to move, to find a safer place. Rose nodded, her mind racing. She was caught in a web of espionage, of secrets and lies, a world she had never imagined she would be a part of. But she was also reunited with the man she loved, the man she had thought lost forever. And she would do whatever it took to protect him, to help him uncover the truth. As they prepared to leave, Thomas paused, his hand on the doorknob. He turned to Rose, his gaze searching hers. Rose, he said, his voice soft, I know this is a lot to ask of you, but I need your help. I need your strength, your courage. Rose met his gaze, her own fear overshadowed by a fierce determination. I'm with you, Thomas, she said, her voice firm. Whatever it takes. He smiled, a flicker of the old Thomas, the man she had fallen in love with, shining through the weariness and the worry. He leaned down and kissed her, a brief, tender kiss that spoke volumes of love, of gratitude, of a shared bond that had survived the ravages of war and deception. They stepped out into the street, the London fog swirling around them, obscuring their path. They were walking wounded, both of them, scarred by the war, by loss, by betrayal. But they were together, and in that, they found a fragile, flickering hope, a determination to face whatever lay ahead, together. They headed towards St. Bartholomew's. Rose reasoned the constant flow of wounded soldiers would make it easy for them to blend in, and she still had trusted friends there who might offer assistance. Chapter 7. A Face from the Past. St. Bartholomew's Hospital, a sprawling complex of buildings near Smithfield Market, was a hive of activity. The air was thick with the smells of antiseptic, blood, and sweat, the sounds of moans, coughs, and the hurried footsteps of medical staff echoing through the corridors. The war had transformed the hospital into a relentless machine, processing the endless stream of wounded soldiers returning from the front. Rose, having worked at the hospital for years, navigated the familiar chaos with practiced ease. She and Thomas, blending in with the throngs of patients, visitors, and staff, made their way through the crowded wards, their senses on high alert. Thomas, despite his attempts to appear nonchalant, was visibly affected by the sights and sounds of the hospital. The raw, visceral reality of the war, the suffering etched on the faces of the wounded, was a stark reminder of the world he had inhabited, the world he had helped to create. Rose, sensing his unease, placed a reassuring hand on his arm.
"It's all right, Thomas," she said softly. "We'll be all right."
She led him towards the nurses' quarters, a quieter, more secluded area of the hospital. She hoped to find her friend, Margaret, a senior nurse who had been her confidant and support throughout the war years. Margaret was a woman of unwavering loyalty and discretion, someone Rose knew she could trust. As they approached the nurses' station, Rose spotted Margaret, her familiar figure bent over a stack of charts. Margaret looked up, her eyes widening in surprise as she saw Rose.
"Rose!"
she exclaimed, a smile spreading across her tired face. "What a surprise. I thought you were taking a few days off." Rose forced a smile, her heart pounding with a mixture of relief and apprehension. I needed to come back," she said, her voice hesitant.
"There's something I need to talk to you about."
"Something important." Margaret's smile faded, replaced by a look of concern. "What is it, Rose? What's wrong?" Rose glanced at Thomas, who stood slightly behind her, his face partially obscured by the shadows. "It's complicated," she said, her voice low. Can we talk somewhere privately?" Margaret nodded, her eyes filled with curiosity. She led them to a small, empty office, a room used for storing medical supplies. She closed the door behind them, ensuring their privacy. Rose took a deep breath, her mind racing. She knew she had to trust Margaret, but revealing Thomas's true identity, his secret life, was a risk. "Margaret," she began, her voice trembling slightly, this is Thomas. "Thomas Sinclair." Margaret's eyes widened in disbelief. She stared at Thomas, her mouth agape. But that's impossible," she stammered. "Thomas Sinclair he's dead. We all saw the notice." Rose explained, as briefly and concisely as possible, the deception, the staged death, Thomas's work as an intelligence operative. Margaret listened in stunned silence, her expression shifting from disbelief to astonishment to a growing understanding. When Rose had finished, Margaret looked at Thomas, her eyes filled with a mixture of awe and apprehension. I don't know what to say," she said, her voice shaking. "This is unbelievable." Thomas stepped forward, his gaze meeting Margaret's. "I know it's a lot to take in, Margaret," he said, his voice sincere. "But I need your help. We need your help." He explained their situation, the mysterious message, the initials on the grave, the suspicion surrounding Rebecca Kincaid. Margaret listened intently, her brow furrowed in concentration. As Thomas spoke, Rose noticed a flicker of recognition in Margaret's eyes, a subtle shift in her expression. When Thomas finished, Margaret was silent for a moment, her gaze fixed on a distant point on the wall. "Rebecca Kincaid," she repeated softly, almost to herself.
"Edka."
She turned to Rose, her eyes widening. "Rose, I think I might know her. Or, at least, I think I might have seen her." Rose and Thomas exchanged a look of surprise. "Seen her?" Rose asked. "Where?" Margaret hesitated, her brow furrowed in thought. "It was a few weeks ago," she said slowly. I was visiting a friend, a former patient, in a private clinic on the outskirts of London. It's a discreet place, for people with certain conditions. Mental conditions." Rose frowned. "A mental clinic?" Margaret nodded. "I saw a woman there, who looked familiar. I couldn't quite place her, but she had the initials RK embroidered on her handkerchief. I remember thinking it was unusual." She paused, her gaze meeting Rose's. "I didn't think much of it at the time, but now, hearing Thomas's story, I think it might be her. I think it might be Rebecca Kincaid." A cold dread washed over Rose. A mental clinic. It suggested a level of instability, of unpredictability, that made Rebecca Kincaid even more dangerous. Chapter 8. The Soldier's Locket. The revelation that Rebecca Kincaid might be, or had been, a patient in a mental clinic cast a long, unsettling shadow over their already precarious situation. It added a layer of complexity, of unpredictability, that made their task even more daunting. If Rebecca was mentally unstable, her actions, her motives, were even more difficult to decipher. Margaret, after sharing her unsettling observation, offered her assistance, promising to provide them with the address of the clinic and any information she could gather about Rebecca Kincaid. She also secured them a temporary refuge within the hospital, a small, unused storage room tucked away in the labyrinthine basement, far from the prying eyes of the main wards. The room was damp and dimly lit, furnished with nothing more than a few crates and a dusty cot. But it was safe, for the moment, a sanctuary from the storm that was gathering around them. As they settled in, Rose couldn't shake the image of Rebecca Kincaid, the woman who held Thomas's life, and now perhaps her own, in her hands. She tried to reconcile the image of a skilled intelligence operative, a woman capable of orchestrating a complex deception, with the possibility of a woman struggling with mental instability. "Thomas," Rose said, her voice low, "what do you know about Rebecca?" "About her background?" Thomas sat down on the cot, his expression troubled. "Not as much as I thought, apparently," he admitted. "She was recruited by my superior, a man named Colonel Davies. He vouched for her, said she was brilliant, resourceful, one of the best operatives he'd ever worked with." He explained that Rebecca had been involved in several successful missions before being assigned to Thomas's case. She had a reputation for being cool under pressure, meticulous in her planning, and fiercely loyal. But there were always hints, he said, his voice hesitant. Rumors, whispers of instability, of a difficult past, a family history of mental illness. He had dismissed those rumors, he admitted, blinded by his trust in Colonel Davies, by his reliance on Rebecca's skills and expertise. He had seen her as a colleague, a partner, someone he could rely on. Now, he was forced to confront the possibility that he had been wrong, that he had placed his trust in someone who was unpredictable, perhaps even dangerous. Rose reached for the locket, still tucked safely inside her coat pocket. She opened it, gazing at the miniature portrait of herself, a tangible reminder of the love that had brought them together, the love that was now threatened by this web of secrets and lies. "This locket," Rose said, her voice soft, "you said Rebecca knew about it. That it was part of the signal." Thomas nodded. "She was the one who suggested it," he said. "She said it would be a secure way of communicating, a way of confirming my identity, of ensuring that any messages were genuine." Rose turned the locket over in her hands, examining the intricate carvings on the back. It was an antique piece, a family heirloom that had belonged to Thomas's mother. She had always admired its beauty, its craftsmanship. As she studied the locket, she noticed something she hadn't seen before. A tiny inscription, almost invisible to the naked eye, hidden within the intricate scrollwork. She held it closer to the dim light, squinting to make out the words.
Veritas vos libre habit.
"The truth will set you free." Rose felt a jolt, a sudden surge of recognition. The Latin phrase, a familiar motto, echoed in her mind. It was the motto of Colonel Davies's regiment. The regiment Thomas had supposedly served in, the regiment that had reported his death. She looked at Thomas, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and understanding. "Thomas," she said, her voice trembling, "this inscription, it's the motto of your Colonel Davies's regiment." Thomas frowned, his brow furrowed in confusion. He took the locket from her, examining the inscription closely. His eyes widened in surprise. "I never noticed this before," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I haven't looked at this locket closely in years." The realization hit them both simultaneously. The locket, the supposed symbol of their love, the key to their communication, was also a link to Colonel Davies, the man who had recruited Rebecca, the man who controlled Thomas's mission. It suggested a deeper connection, a more complex web of relationships than they had previously imagined. Colonel Davies, Rebecca Kincaid, Thomas, they were all connected, not just by their shared profession, but by something more, something hidden, something that was only now beginning to surface. The locket had presented more questions. Was Davies good? Was he involved? Was he the he who watches? The questions mounted, eroding any sense of safety they'd found. Chapter 9. Beneath a Sky of Smoke. The discovery of the regimental motto inscribed on the locket had cast a new, and deeply unsettling, light on their situation. Colonel Davies, the man Thomas had trusted implicitly, the man who had orchestrated his death and controlled his mission, was now a figure of suspicion. Was he a benevolent mastermind, guiding Thomas through a dangerous game, or was he a puppet master, pulling strings for his own, unknown purposes? The cramped, dimly lit storage room, their temporary sanctuary, felt increasingly claustrophobic. The air was thick with unanswered questions, with the weight of their growing fears. They needed answers, and they needed them quickly. Rose, drawing on her connections within the hospital, managed to secure a map of London and a few basic supplies, a change of clothes for Thomas, some food, and a small first aid kit. Margaret, risking her own position, provided them with the address of the private clinic where she had seen the woman she believed to be Rebecca Kincaid. The clinic, known as Oak Haven, was located in a secluded area of Hampstead Heath, a sprawling expanse of woods and hills on the northern outskirts of London. It was a place of quiet isolation, a place where secrets could be kept, where people could disappear. As they prepared to leave the hospital, under the cover of darkness, a thick fog had descended upon London, blanketing the city in a dense, white shroud. The air was heavy with the smell of coal smoke and damp earth, the sounds of the city muffled and distorted. Thomas, his senses heightened by years of living in the shadows, led Rose through the fog-shrouded streets, his hand firmly clasped in hers. They moved like ghosts, their footsteps silent, their presence unnoticed. The journey to Hampstead Heath was long and arduous. They traveled by foot and by a series of clandestine bus rides, avoiding the main thoroughfares, sticking to the back streets and alleyways. The fog, while providing them with cover, also added to the sense of disorientation, of being lost in a labyrinth of unknown dangers. As they neared Oak Haven, the landscape began to change. The dense, urban sprawl gave way to open fields and wooded hills. The air grew cleaner, fresher, but the sense of isolation of being watched intensified. The clinic itself was a large, imposing Victorian mansion, surrounded by high walls and overgrown gardens. It looked more like a prison than a place of healing, its windows dark and forbidding, its facade shrouded in shadows. They approached the clinic cautiously, circling the perimeter, looking for a way to enter undetected. The main gate was locked and guarded, but Thomas, drawing on his experience, found a small, overgrown side entrance, hidden behind a thicket of bushes. He produced a small set of tools, the tools of his trade, and quickly and silently picked the lock. They slipped inside the grounds, their hearts pounding with a mixture of fear and anticipation. The gardens were overgrown and neglected, the paths choked with weeds, the air thick with the scent of decay. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the rustling of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. They made their way towards the main building, keeping to the shadows, their senses on high alert. They reached a small, side door, partially hidden by a tangle of ivy. Thomas tried the handle, but it was locked. He was about to pick the lock when Rose noticed something. A faint light, flickering through a crack in the boarded-up window next to the door. She pointed it out to Thomas, her heart quickening. Someone was inside. Thomas pressed his ear against the door, listening intently. He could hear faint sounds, muffled voices, coming from within. He motioned for Rose to stay back, and then, with a swift, decisive movement, he kicked the door open. The room they entered was dimly lit, illuminated by a single, flickering candle. It looked like an office or a study, furnished with a desk, a chair, and a bookshelf filled with leather-bound volumes. Standing in the center of the room, her back to them, was a woman. She was dressed in a dark, tailored suit, her hair pulled back in a severe bun. She turned as she heard them enter, her eyes widening in surprise. It was Rebecca Kincaid, and she was holding a gun, pointed directly at Thomas. The candlelight glinted off the metal, a stark, chilling reminder of the danger they were in. Beneath the dim, smoky light of the room, a tense standoff began, the air thick with unspoken accusations and the threat of imminent violence. Chapter 10. The Dance of Shadows. The scene that greeted them was a tableau of tension. Rebecca Kincaid, her face a mask of surprise and apprehension, holding a pistol aimed squarely at Thomas. The flickering candlelight cast long, dancing shadows on the walls, amplifying the drama of the moment. "Thomas," Rebecca said, her voice surprisingly steady, betraying none of the mental instability Margaret had suggested. "What are you doing here?" Thomas stood his ground, his hands raised slightly, a gesture of non-aggression. "We need to talk, Rebecca. About the initials. About the message." Rebecca's eyes narrowed. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't play games with me, Rebecca," Thomas said, his voice hardening. "You carved the initials on the grave. You sent the message to meet at St. Paul's." Rebecca lowered the gun slightly, but her grip remained firm. "That was a precaution. A way to ensure your safety." "By jeopardizing my mission?" Thomas retorted. "By exposing me? I had to know if you were still you," Rebecca said, her voice faltering slightly. "There were rumors."
Doubts.
"Doubts?"
About me?
Thomas asked, his voice laced with disbelief. "Or about yourself, Rebecca?" The mention of her mental state, the unspoken accusation hanging in the air, seemed to hit a nerve. Rebecca's hand trembled slightly, her composure momentarily cracking. Rose, sensing an opportunity, stepped forward, her voice calm and reassuring. "Rebecca," she said, "we're not here to hurt you. We just want to understand. We want to know what's going on." Rebecca's gaze shifted to Rose, her eyes filled with a mixture of suspicion and something else. "Recognition? Familiarity?" "You're Rose," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thomas is Rose." Rose nodded.
"Yes."
"And I know about your work with Thomas. About the mission." Rebecca's eyes flickered back to Thomas, her expression unreadable. "He told you?" "He had to," Rose said. "We're in this together now." A tense silence filled the room, the only sound the crackling of the candle and the distant rumble of thunder. The storm that had been brewing outside seemed to mirror the storm raging within the room. Rebecca slowly lowered the gun, her hand still trembling. "I don't know what to believe anymore," she said, her voice filled with a mixture of confusion and despair. "I don't know who to trust." "Trust us, Rebecca," Thomas said, his voice softening. "Tell us what's happening. Tell us about Colonel Davies." The mention of Colonel Davies's name seemed to trigger something in Rebecca. Her eyes widened, her face paling. He's not who you think he is," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He's using us. All of us." She explained, in a halting, fragmented way, that Colonel Davies had been manipulating them, feeding them false information, using their missions for his own personal gain. He was involved in a complex conspiracy, a network of double agents and secret deals that reached the highest levels of the British government. "He's selling secrets," Rebecca said, her voice filled with a mixture of anger and fear. "Selling them to the enemy." The revelation was a bombshell, a devastating blow to everything Thomas had believed, everything he had fought for. He had been a pawn in a larger game, a tool used by a man he had trusted implicitly.
"But why?"
Rose asked. "Why would he do that?" Rebecca shook her head. "I don't know. Power? Money? Ideology? I don't know his motives. But I know he's dangerous. He's ruthless. He'll stop at nothing to achieve his goals." She explained that she had discovered Davies's treachery by accident, stumbling upon a series of coded messages, a hidden ledger that revealed his double dealings. She had tried to expose him, but he had anticipated her move, discrediting her, spreading rumors about her mental instability, confining her to Oak Haven. "He's been watching me," Rebecca said, her voice filled with fear. "He knows I'm a threat. He's been controlling me, manipulating me, trying to silence me." The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fall into place. The initials on the grave, the message to meet at St. Paul's, Rebecca's erratic behavior, it was all part of a desperate attempt to reach out, to warn Thomas, to expose Davies's treachery. But the question remained: how to stop him? How to expose a man so powerful, so deeply entrenched in the system? As they discussed their options, a sudden noise from outside the room broke the tension. The sound of footsteps, approaching quickly. Davies's men. They were trapped. Rebecca, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination, grabbed a small, leather-bound book from the desk. "This," she said, her voice urgent, "this is the evidence. The proof of Davies's treachery. You need to get this to the right people. To someone you can trust." She handed the book to Rose, her hand trembling.
"You have to go," she said.
"You have to expose him. Before it's too late." Thomas knew they had to escape, and fast. But leaving Rebecca behind, at the mercy of Davies's men, was not an option. He looked at Rose, his eyes filled with a silent plea. Rose understood. She nodded, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. They would face this together. They had the evidence. Now they needed a plan. Chapter 11. Confessions in Candlelight. The sound of approaching footsteps spurred them into action. Thomas quickly extinguished the candle, plunging the room into darkness, using the momentary confusion to their advantage. He grabbed a heavy iron poker from beside the fireplace, a makeshift weapon in a desperate situation. Rebecca, despite her fear, moved with a surprising agility, guiding them towards a narrow, concealed door behind the bookshelf. It led to a hidden passage, a secret escape route known only to a few. "This way," she whispered, her voice urgent.
"Hurry."
They slipped through the door, just as the main door to the office burst open. Silhouetted figures, Davies's men, stormed into the room, their shouts echoing in the darkness. The passage was narrow and dusty, barely wide enough for them to move single file. Rebecca led the way, her familiarity with the hidden route guiding them through the darkness. Thomas followed close behind, the iron poker held tightly in his hand, ready to defend them if necessary. Rose brought up the rear, clutching the leather-bound book, the crucial evidence, to her chest. The passage twisted and turned, a labyrinthine maze beneath the old mansion. The air was thick with dust and the smell of damp earth, the silence broken only by their hurried breaths and the muffled sounds of pursuit from above. After what seemed like an eternity, they reached another door, hidden at the end of the passage. Rebecca cautiously opened it, peering out into the darkness. "The gardens," she whispered. "We can escape through the back gate. It's unguarded." They emerged into the cool night air, the fog still swirling around them, providing them with a measure of cover. They moved quickly and silently, sticking to the shadows, making their way towards the back of the estate. As they neared the gate, they heard voices, the sound of men searching the grounds. Davies's men were closing in. They reached the gate, a wrought iron barrier that separated them from freedom. Thomas quickly examined the lock, his skilled hands working swiftly and silently. He produced his tools, the same tools he had used to enter the clinic, and began to pick the lock. The minutes stretched into an eternity, the tension mounting with each passing second. The voices of Davies's men grew closer, their footsteps echoing in the night. Finally, with a soft click, the lock yielded. Thomas swung the gate open, and they slipped through, disappearing into the fog-shrouded darkness. They ran, their lungs burning, their legs aching, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and Oakhaven. They didn't stop until they reached the edge of Hampstead Heath, where they collapsed, breathless and exhausted, beneath the shelter of a large oak tree. They were safe, for the moment, but they knew Davies would not give up. He would hunt them relentlessly, using all his resources to silence them, to retrieve the evidence. As they caught their breath, Rose turned to Rebecca, her voice filled with concern. "Rebecca," she said, "are you all right?" Rebecca nodded, her face pale and drawn. I think so," she said, her voice trembling. "Thank you for rescuing me." "We're in this together now," Rose said, her hand resting reassuringly on Rebecca's arm. Thomas, his gaze fixed on the distant lights of Oakhaven, spoke, his voice low and determined. We need to get this evidence to someone we can trust, he said. Someone who can expose Davies. But who? Rose asked. Who can we trust? Rebecca hesitated, her brow furrowed in thought. There is one person, she said slowly. Someone who might be able to help. Someone who has a personal vendetta against Davies. She explained that Davies had a former associate, a man named Alistair Finch, who had been betrayed and disgraced by Davies years ago. Finch, a former intelligence officer, had been framed for treason, stripped of his rank and honors, and forced into hiding. He's been living in the shadows, Rebecca said, waiting for an opportunity to clear his name, to get revenge on Davies. He might be our only hope. Finding Finch, however, would be a challenge. He was a master of disguise, a ghost in the machine, his whereabouts unknown. As they discussed their options, the first rays of dawn began to break through the fog, casting a pale, ethereal light over the landscape. The sky, a canvas of swirling gray and pale pink, mirrored the uncertainty of their situation. Rose, looking at Thomas and Rebecca, their faces etched with exhaustion and determination, felt a surge of strength, a renewed sense of purpose. She had been drawn into this world of shadows and secrets, a world she had never imagined she would be a part of. But she was not afraid. She was with the man she loved, and she had found an unexpected ally in Rebecca. They had a long and dangerous road ahead of them, but they were not alone. They had the evidence, they had a lead, and they had each other. In the pale, flickering light of dawn, surrounded by the remnants of the fog, Rebecca began to share her story, her voice soft and hesitant at first, then gaining strength as she spoke. She recounted her years working for Davies, the missions she had undertaken, the secrets she had uncovered. She spoke of her growing disillusionment, her suspicions about Davies's true motives, her desperate attempts to expose him. She confessed her fears, her doubts, her struggles with the darkness that had surrounded her. It was a confession, a catharsis, a release of the burdens she had carried for so long. And as she spoke, Rose saw not a dangerous, unstable woman, but a victim, a survivor, a woman who had been used and betrayed by a man she had trusted. The candlelight of the emerging dawn illuminated not just their faces, but also the shared pain and the fragile bond that was forming between them. They were three wounded souls, brought together by circumstance, united by a common enemy, and determined to fight for justice, for truth, for a future free from the shadows of war and betrayal. The first step, find Alistair Finch. Chapter 12. The Price of Loyalty. Finding Alistair Finch proved to be as challenging as they had anticipated. Rebecca only knew fragments of his past, whispers of his contacts, and the general area where he was rumored to be hiding the labyrinthine docklands of East London, a sprawling network of warehouses, wharves, and narrow alleyways, a haven for smugglers, criminals, and those seeking to disappear. They spent days scouring the docklands, following tenuous leads, questioning wary informants, their every move shadowed by the fear of discovery. The air was thick with a smell of salt water, tar, and decay. The sounds of creaking ships, shouting dockworkers, and the cries of seagulls echoing through the narrow streets. Thomas, drawing on his intelligence training, used his skills of observation and deduction to navigate the treacherous underworld. He blended in with the rough and tumble crowd, his appearance altered by the clothes Rose had procured, his demeanor shifting from that of a refined captain to a hardened dockworker. Rose, despite her initial apprehension, proved to be a valuable asset. Her knowledge of London, her ability to connect with people, and her unwavering determination opened doors that would have remained closed to Thomas alone. She used her nursing experience to gain the trust of the dockworkers and their families, offering medical assistance in exchange for information. Rebecca, still recovering from her ordeal at Oak Haven, remained mostly in the shadows, her knowledge of Finch's past providing crucial guidance. She was a fragile ally, her mental state still precarious, but her determination to expose Davies fueled her every action. They followed a trail of cryptic clues, whispered rumors, and coded messages, each step bringing them closer to their quarry, but also deeper into danger. They knew Davies would be searching for them, his network of informants stretching throughout the city, his reach extending into the darkest corners of the underworld. One evening, after a fruitless day of searching, they found themselves in a dimly lit pub, a smoky, crowded establishment frequented by dock workers, sailors, and the denizens of the shadows. They were exhausted, discouraged, their hopes dwindling. As they sat at a secluded table, nursing their drinks, a gruff voice spoke from behind them. Looking for someone? They turned to see a man, his face weathered and scarred, his eyes sharp and intelligent. He was dressed in the rough clothes of a dock worker, but there was something about his demeanor, his bearing, that suggested a different past. Thomas hesitated, his instincts warning him of danger. But they were desperate, and this man seemed to know something. "We're looking for Alistair Finch," Thomas said, his voice low. The man's eyes narrowed. "And who might you be?" Thomas exchanged a glance with Rose and Rebecca. They had agreed on a cover story, a fabricated identity that would protect them from Davies's reach. "We're friends of Rebecca Kincaid," Thomas said. "We have information about Colonel Davies." The man's expression changed, a flicker of surprise, followed by a cautious interest. He sat down at their table, his gaze sweeping over them. "Rebecca Kincaid," he repeated, his voice thoughtful. "I haven't heard that name in a long time." He listened intently as Thomas, using their agreed-upon cover story, explained their situation, their search for Finch, their need to expose Davies's treachery. He revealed the existence of the leather-bound book, the evidence that could bring Davies down. When Thomas had finished, the man was silent for a moment, his eyes studying them, assessing their trustworthiness. "I might know where to find Finch," he said finally, "but it's not going to be easy. He's a cautious man, a man with many enemies." He explained that Finch was hiding in a derelict warehouse on the Isle of Dogs, a remote, isolated area of the Docklands. He was protected by a small group of loyal followers, former soldiers who had been wronged by Davies, men who shared his desire for revenge. "Getting to him will be risky," the man warned. "Davies has eyes and ears everywhere. And Finch he doesn't trust easily." They knew the risks, but they were determined. They had come too far, sacrificed too much, to turn back now. The man, who introduced himself as Silas, agreed to guide them to Finch's hideout. He was a former associate of Finch, a man who had also been betrayed by Davies, his loyalty to his former comrade unwavering. As they prepared to leave the pub, Silas turned to Thomas, his eyes filled with a mixture of warning and respect. "Davies is a dangerous man," he said. "He's destroyed many good people. Be careful. Loyalty, it comes at a price." His words hung in the air, a stark reminder of the stakes they were facing. They were not just fighting a corrupt officer, they were fighting a system, a web of power and influence that had protected Davies for years. They stepped out into the night, the fog swirling around them, obscuring their path. They were heading into the heart of darkness, towards a confrontation that could determine their fate and the fate of the nation. The price of loyalty, they knew, could be very high indeed, but they were prepared to pay it. Chapter 13. Trenches of the Heart. The journey to the Isle of Dogs was a tense, silent affair. Silas led them through a maze of narrow, winding streets, past darkened warehouses and silent wharves, the only sounds their footsteps and the distant cries of gulls. The fog, thick and oppressive, clung to everything, creating an eerie, almost surreal atmosphere. Rose, walking beside Thomas, felt a familiar wave of fear wash over her. But it was a different kind of fear than she had experienced before. It was not just the fear of physical danger, but the fear of losing Thomas again, of having their fragile reunion shattered by the forces arrayed against them. She reached for his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. The simple touch, a connection in the darkness, reassured her, reminding her that they were not alone, that they had each other. Thomas squeezed her hand, his gaze meeting hers. He understood her fears, her unspoken anxieties. He had his own demons to contend with, the guilt of his deception, the burden of his past, the weight of his responsibility. "We'll get through this, Rose," he whispered, his voice low and reassuring. "Together." His words, A promise in the darkness gave her strength, a renewed sense of determination. She would not falter. She would not let fear consume her. She would fight for him, for their future, for the hope of a life together, free from the shadows of war and betrayal. They reached the derelict warehouse, a hulking, skeletal structure looming in the fog. It looked abandoned, deserted, its windows broken, its walls crumbling. But Silas assured them that Finch was inside, hidden within its decaying walls. Silas led them to a hidden entrance, a small, rusted door concealed behind a pile of discarded crates. He knocked on the door in a specific pattern, a coded signal that identified them as allies. The door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit passage. A man, armed with a rifle, stood guard, his eyes scanning them suspiciously. Silas spoke to the guard in hushed tones, explaining their presence, their connection to Rebecca Kincaid. The guard, after a moment of hesitation, nodded and stepped aside, allowing them to enter. The interior of the warehouse was a cavernous space, filled with the debris of its former life. Rusted machinery, broken crates, and piles of rubble littered the floor. The air was thick with dust and the smell of decay. In the center of the warehouse, a small group of men were gathered around a makeshift table, illuminated by a single, flickering lantern. They were a rough-looking bunch, their faces weathered and scarred, their eyes reflecting a mixture of hardship and determination. These were Finch's loyal followers, men who had been wronged by Davies, men who had nothing left to lose. As they approached, a man rose from the table, his gaze fixed on them. He was tall and lean, his hair silvered with age, his face bearing the marks of a hard life. But his eyes, sharp and intelligent, held a spark of fire, a hint of the man he once was. This was Alistair Finch. Silas introduced them, explaining their mission, their connection to Rebecca, the evidence they carried. Finch listened intently, his expression unreadable, his eyes assessing them, searching for any sign of deception. When Thomas had finished, Finch was silent for a moment, his gaze shifting from one to the other. "Rebecca Kincaid," he said finally, his voice raspy. "She was a good woman.
Brave.
Too trusting." He turned to Rose, his eyes studying her intently. "And you're the reason Sinclair came back from the dead." Rose nodded, her heart pounding. "I am." Finch's gaze softened slightly. "Love," he said, a hint of sadness in his voice. "A powerful force. A dangerous one." He turned to Thomas. "Davies, he destroyed my life. He framed me, took everything from me. I've been waiting for this opportunity, for a chance to get my revenge." He extended his hand, his grip firm and strong. "I'll help you," he said. "We'll expose Davies together. We'll bring him down." Rose felt a wave of relief wash over her. They had found an ally, a powerful ally, in their fight against Davies. But she also sensed the pain, the bitterness that consumed Finch, the years of living in the shadows, fueled by a desire for revenge. They spent the rest of the night huddled around the lantern, poring over the evidence, planning their strategy. The leather-bound book, Rebecca's meticulous record of Davies' treachery, was a damning indictment, a detailed account of his double dealings, his betrayal of his country. As they discussed their options, Rose found herself drawn to Finch, to his story, to his unwavering determination. He was a man who had lost everything, a man who had been forced to live in the trenches of the heart, battling his own demons, fighting for survival. She saw in him a reflection of Thomas, a glimpse of what he might have become if he had not found his way back to her. And she realized that the war, the real war, was not just fought on the battlefields, but in the hearts and minds of those who were caught in its web. The trenches of the heart, she realized, were just as deep, just as dangerous as the trenches of the battlefield. And the scars they left, the wounds they inflicted, could be just as devastating. But even in the darkest of trenches, she knew there was always hope. A flicker of light, a spark of love, a reason to keep fighting. Chapter 14. A promise etched in blood. With Alistair Finch's support, their plan to expose Colonel Davies began to take shape. Finch, drawing on his years of experience and intelligence, devised a strategy that was both daring and intricate. He knew Davies's weaknesses, his contacts, his methods of operation. He knew how to strike at the heart of Davies's network, how to dismantle his carefully constructed web of deceit. The plan involved using the evidence in Rebecca's book to leak information to key individuals within the government and the military, individuals who were known to be loyal to the crown, individuals who had the power to investigate Davies and bring him to justice. It was a risky strategy, a delicate dance of shadows and whispers. One wrong move, one misplaced trust, could expose them all, leading to their capture, or worse. Finch assigned roles to each member of their small group. Thomas, with his intelligence training and his first-hand knowledge of Davies's operation, would be the point man, delivering the evidence to key contacts, navigating the treacherous world of wartime London. Rose, with her connections at St. Bartholomew's Hospital and her ability to blend in with the civilian population, would act as a courier, carrying messages and information between Finch and Thomas, ensuring their communication remained secure. Rebecca, still recovering from her ordeal, would remain hidden at Finch's hideout, her knowledge of Davies's secrets providing crucial guidance and support. Silas, with his knowledge of the Docklands and his network of contacts, would provide logistical support, ensuring their safety and anonymity. They worked tirelessly, meticulously planning every detail, anticipating every contingency. They knew Davies would be ruthless, relentless, using all his resources to silence them. They had to be smarter, faster, more determined. As they prepared for their mission, Rose found herself drawn closer to Thomas, their bond strengthened by the shared danger, the shared purpose. They had been through so much together, had faced death and deception, had found their way back to each other against all odds. One evening, as they sat alone in the dimly lit warehouse, their faces illuminated by the flickering lantern, Thomas took Rose's hand, his gaze meeting hers. "Rose," he said, his voice low and earnest, "I know this isn't the life I promised you. It's not the life we dreamed of." Rose squeezed his hand, her heart aching with a mixture of love and sadness. "We didn't choose this life, Thomas," she said, "but we can choose how we face it. Together." He leaned in and kissed her, a tender, passionate kiss that spoke volumes of their love, their commitment, their unwavering bond. It was a kiss that transcended the darkness, the danger, the uncertainty that surrounded them. "When this is over," Thomas said, his voice husky with emotion, "when we're finally free, I promise you, Rose, we'll have a life together. A real life, away from all this." Rose nodded, her eyes filled with tears. "I know, Thomas," she said. "I believe that." But even as she spoke the words, a shadow of doubt, a flicker of fear, crossed her mind. She knew the price of loyalty, the cost of freedom. She knew that promises made in the midst of war, in the heart of darkness, could be fragile, fleeting, easily broken. The next morning, they set their plan in motion. Thomas, disguised as a dock worker, left the warehouse, carrying a carefully concealed portion of the evidence, his destination a clandestine meeting with a high-ranking officer known to be a close confidant of the Prime Minister. Rose, dressed as a nurse, left shortly after, her mission to deliver a coded message to one of Finch's contacts, a journalist with connections to a powerful newspaper. They moved separately, cautiously, their every step shadowed by danger. They knew Davies would be watching, waiting, his network of informants spread throughout the city. As Rose made her way through the crowded streets, she felt a growing sense of unease, a prickling sensation on the back of her neck. She had the feeling she was being followed, watched. She quickened her pace, her heart pounding, her eyes scanning the faces in the crowd. She couldn't see anyone suspicious, but the feeling persisted, a nagging sense of dread that wouldn't go away. She reached her destination, a small, unassuming coffee shop near Fleet Street. She entered the shop, her senses on high alert, and scanned the room. She spotted her contact, a man sitting alone at a table near the back, reading a newspaper. She approached him cautiously, her hand clutching the coded message in her pocket. As she neared the table, a figure stepped out from behind a pillar, blocking her path. It was a man in a dark coat, his face obscured by the shadows. Rose froze, her heart leaping into her throat. She recognized the man. It was one of Davies's men, the same man who had been at Oakhaven, the man who had stormed the office. He smiled, a cold, cruel smile that sent a shiver down her spine. "Going somewhere, Miss Kensington?" he said, his voice smooth and menacing. Rose knew she was trapped. She had been betrayed. Someone had leaked their plan, their movements, to Davies. As the man reached for her, a sudden commotion erupted near the entrance of the coffee shop. A group of dock workers, led by Silas, stormed into the shop, their faces grim, their hands wielding makeshift weapons. A fight ensued, a chaotic brawl that filled the small coffee shop with the sounds of shouting, crashing furniture, and breaking glass. Rose, caught in the middle of the melee, struggled to defend herself. Silas, fighting his way through the crowd, reached Rose, his face covered in blood.
"Go,"
he shouted, his voice hoarse. "Get the message to Finch. We'll hold them off." Rose, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and gratitude, slipped out of the coffee shop, disappearing into the crowded streets. She ran, her lungs burning, her legs aching, the image of Silas, fighting to protect her, etched in her mind. She knew she had to reach Finch, to warn him, to tell him that their plan had been compromised. She had to keep the promise she had made to Thomas, to herself, to fight for their future, for their freedom. But as she ran, a single, terrifying thought echoed in her mind. What if she was already too late? What if Thomas had walked into a trap? The image of his blood, a promise etched not in ink, but in the very essence of their struggle, haunted her every step. Chapter 15. The Spy Among Us. Rose raced back to the warehouse on the Isle of Dogs, her lungs burning, her heart pounding with a desperate urgency. The image of Silas, fighting to protect her, fueled her every stride. She had to reach Finch, to warn him that their plan had been compromised, that Davies knew their every move. As she approached the warehouse, she saw a scene that made her blood run cold. The building was surrounded by soldiers, their rifles pointed, their faces grim. Smoke billowed from the broken windows, the air filled with the sounds of gunfire and shouting. Davies had found them. Rose's first instinct was to rush into the warehouse, to find Thomas, to help him. But she knew it was a suicide mission. She would be captured, killed, and the evidence, the last hope of exposing Davies, would be lost. She forced herself to think, to act strategically. She had to find another way, a way to reach Finch, to warn him, to salvage their plan. She remembered a hidden passage, a secret tunnel that Rebecca had mentioned, an escape route that led from the warehouse to a nearby wharf. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble, but it was their only hope. She circled the warehouse, keeping to the shadows, avoiding the soldiers. She found the entrance to the tunnel, a small, concealed opening hidden beneath a pile of discarded rubbish. She slipped into the tunnel, the darkness swallowing her whole. The air was thick with dust and the smell of damp earth, the silence broken only by the muffled sounds of the battle raging above. She navigated the tunnel cautiously, her hands groping along the cold, damp walls. The passage twisted and turned, a labyrinthine maze beneath the warehouse. She had no idea where it led, or if Finch and the others were even still alive. After what seemed like an eternity, she saw a faint light ahead. She reached the end of the tunnel, a small opening that led to a hidden wharf, a narrow strip of land bordering the Thames. She emerged from the tunnel, her eyes blinking in the dim light. She scanned the wharf, her heart sinking. There was no sign of Finch, of Thomas, of anyone. Then, she heard a voice, a faint, weak voice calling her name. Rose rose, she turned to see a figure, slumped against a stack of crates, his face covered in blood, his clothes torn and tattered. It was Finch. She rushed to his side, her heart filled with a mixture of relief and despair. He was alive, but he was badly wounded. "Finch," she said, her voice trembling, "what happened? Where's Thomas?" Finch coughed, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Davies, he knew everything, he said, his voice weak. He had a spy among us.
A spy.
The realization hit Rose like a physical blow. Someone within their group, someone they had trusted, had betrayed them to Davies. Who? Rose asked, her voice urgent. Who was the spy? Finch struggled to speak, his eyes filled with pain and regret. Silas, he whispered, his voice barely audible. It was Silas. Silas. The man who had guided them to Finch, the man who had claimed to be loyal to Finch, the man who had fought to protect her in the coffee shop. It was all a lie, a carefully constructed deception. Rose felt a wave of nausea wash over her. She had been betrayed, manipulated, used. Silas had played them all, leading them into a trap, delivering them to Davies. Thomas, Rose said, her voice filled with a desperate plea. Where's Thomas? Finch shook his head weakly. He stayed behind, he said. To buy us time. To let us escape. Thomas had sacrificed himself, knowing the risks, knowing the odds. He had stayed behind to face Davies, to give them a chance to survive, to expose the truth. Rose felt a surge of grief, of anger, of despair. But she knew she couldn't give up. She had to honor Thomas's sacrifice. She had to complete their mission. She had to bring Davies to justice. The evidence, Finch said, his voice fading. The book, you have it? Rose nodded, clutching the leather-bound book to her chest. Yes, she said. I have it. Finch smiled weakly.
Good, he said.
Get it to the authorities. To someone you can trust. He closed his eyes, his breathing growing shallow. Rose knew he was dying. She took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. I will. Finch, she said, her voice choked with emotion. I promise you, I won't let you down. Finch's grip tightened slightly, and then, with a final, shuddering breath, he was gone. Rose sat there, alone in the darkness, the body of Alistair Finch beside her, the weight of their loss, their betrayal, crushing her. But she knew she couldn't stay there. She had to escape, to find a way to deliver the evidence, to expose Davies, to avenge Thomas and Finch. As she stood up, her legs trembling, her eyes filled with tears, she saw something glinting in the dim light. It was a small, silver locket, lying on the ground near Finch's hand. Thomas's locket. She picked it up, her fingers tracing the familiar inscription, Veritas vos liberbit. The truth will set you free. The locket, a symbol of their love, a reminder of their promise, gave her strength, a renewed sense of purpose. She would not falter. She would not give up. She would fight for the truth, for justice, for the memory of those she had lost. She slipped the locket into her pocket, a tangible reminder of Thomas's love, of his sacrifice. And then, with a heavy heart, but with a renewed determination, she turned and walked away, disappearing into the fog, a lone figure on a mission of vengeance and redemption. Chapter 16. Betrayal's Bitter Sting. The revelation of Silas's treachery had been a devastating blow, a bitter pill to swallow. Rose, reeling from the shock and grief of Finch's death and Thomas's presumed capture, found herself alone and adrift in the fog-shrouded docklands, the weight of her responsibility pressing down on her. She knew she had to reach someone in authority, someone she could trust with the evidence, someone who could expose Davies and bring him to justice. But who? Davies's reach extended far and wide, his influence permeating the highest levels of government and the military. She thought of Margaret, her trusted friend at St. Bartholomew's, but she knew that contacting her would be too risky. Davies would be watching the hospital, monitoring her communications, waiting for her to make a move. Then, she remembered a name that Rebecca had mentioned in passing, Lord Ashworth, a member of Parliament known for his integrity and his unwavering opposition to corruption. Ashworth was a powerful figure, a man with connections to the highest echelons of power, a man who could potentially challenge Davies. Finding Lord Ashworth, however, would be a challenge. He was a reclusive figure, rarely seen in public, his movements carefully guarded. Rose, drawing on her knowledge of London and her resourcefulness, decided to seek help from an unlikely source, the network of nurses and volunteers she had worked with at St. Bartholomew's. She knew they were loyal, discreet, and deeply connected to the city's hidden undercurrents. She made her way to a small, unassuming tea shop near the hospital, a place where nurses often gathered during their breaks. She entered the shop cautiously, scanning the faces, searching for someone she could trust. She spotted a familiar face, a young nurse named Elsie, who had worked with her in the surgical ward. Elsie was a quiet, unassuming woman, but Rose knew she was sharp, intelligent, and fiercely loyal. Rose approached Elsie cautiously, drawing her aside to a secluded corner of the tea shop. She explained her situation as briefly and discreetly as possible, emphasizing the urgency and the importance of her mission. Elsie listened intently, her eyes widening in surprise and concern. She knew of Davies's reputation, of his ruthless ambition, of the rumors of his corruption. "I'll help you, Rose," Elsie said, her voice firm and determined. "I know someone who might be able to reach Lord Ashworth. Someone who moves in those circles." Elsie explained that she had a cousin, a young man named Arthur, who worked as a clerk in the Houses of Parliament. Arthur was a discreet, reliable individual, with access to information and contacts that could be invaluable. Elsie agreed to contact Arthur to arrange a meeting between him and Rose to deliver the evidence to Lord Ashworth. It was a risky plan, a gamble, but it was their best hope. They arranged a meeting for the following evening at a small, secluded park near Westminster Abbey. Rose, feeling a flicker of hope amidst the darkness, thanked Elsie for her help, her gratitude overwhelming. As she left the tea shop, she felt a renewed sense of determination. She would not be defeated. She would not let Davies win. She would expose his treachery, avenge Thomas and Finch, and bring justice to those who had been wronged. But as she walked away, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, the sense of a lurking presence, a shadow following her every move. Silas's betrayal had shaken her trust, had made her question everyone and everything. She knew that Davies would not give up. He would be hunting her relentlessly, using all his resources to silence her, to retrieve the evidence. He would be one step ahead, anticipating her every move. The betrayal's bitter sting had left a wound, a deep scar that would never fully heal. But it had also ignited a fire within her, a burning desire for justice, for revenge, for a future free from the shadows of war and deceit. She would fight, she would persevere, she would not rest until Davies was brought down. She owed it to Thomas, to Finch, to all those who had suffered at his hands. And she owed it to herself. Chapter 17. Scars That Never Heal. The meeting with Arthur, Elsie's cousin, was fraught with tension. The secluded park near Westminster Abbey, usually a place of peace and tranquility, felt menacing in the darkness, the shadows of the ancient buildings looming large and ominous. Rose arrived early, her senses on high alert, scanning the surroundings for any sign of danger. She clutched the leather-bound book, the evidence of Davies's treachery, tightly in her hands, its weight a constant reminder of her responsibility. Arthur arrived shortly after, a young man, nervous and hesitant, his eyes darting around nervously. He was clearly out of his depth, caught in a dangerous game he didn't fully understand. Rose, drawing on her experience as a nurse, tried to reassure him, speaking to him calmly and patiently, explaining the importance of his role, the urgency of their mission. Arthur, reassured by Rose's demeanor, agreed to help. He explained that he had access to Lord Ashworth's office, that he could deliver the evidence directly to him, bypassing Davies's watchful eyes. It was a risky plan, a delicate operation that required precise timing and unwavering discretion. One wrong move, one misplaced trust, could expose them all, leading to their capture or worse. They arranged for Arthur to deliver the book the following morning, during a brief window of opportunity when Lord Ashworth was scheduled to be alone in his office. Arthur would leave the book on his desk, discreetly marked with a coded message that would identify it as coming from Rose. Rose, feeling a mixture of relief and apprehension, thanked Arthur for his help, her gratitude tempered by the knowledge of the risks he was taking. As she left the park, she felt a growing sense of unease, a premonition of danger. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, that Davies was closing in. She decided to return to St. Bartholomew's, to seek refuge in the familiar surroundings of the hospital, to seek comfort in the company of her friend, Margaret. But as she approached the hospital, she saw a scene that made her blood run cold. The building was surrounded by police officers, their faces grim, their movements purposeful. Davies had made his move. Rose knew she couldn't enter the hospital. She would be captured, questioned, and the evidence, her last hope of exposing Davies, would be lost. She turned and fled, her heart pounding, her mind racing. She had to find another way, a way to reach Lord Ashworth, a way to expose Davies before it was too late. She thought of Rebecca, still hiding at Finch's derelict warehouse, the only person who knew the full extent of Davies's treachery. She had to reach Rebecca, to warn her, to seek her help. But as she made her way back towards the Docklands, she realized the futility of her efforts. Davies would be watching Rebecca, waiting for Rose to lead him to her. She was trapped, isolated, alone. She had nowhere to turn, no one to trust. Davies had anticipated her every move, had outmaneuvered her at every turn. She sank down onto a bench in a deserted park, the weight of her despair crushing her. She had failed. She had lost Thomas. She had lost Finch, and now, she had lost the evidence, her last hope of bringing Davies to justice. As tears streamed down her face, she felt a hand on her shoulder, a gentle touch that made her jump. She turned to see a figure standing beside her, a figure shrouded in shadows. "Rose," a familiar voice said. It was Thomas. He was alive. Rose stared at him, her mind unable to comprehend what she was seeing. She had seen him captured. She had believed him to be dead. "Thomas," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "But how?" Thomas smiled, a weary, bittersweet smile that spoke volumes of the suffering he had endured. "It's a long story, Rose," he said. "A story of survival, of escape, of sheer luck." He explained that he had managed to escape from Davies's men, using his intelligence training, his skills of evasion, to disappear into the labyrinthine streets of London. He had been wounded, hunted, but he had survived. He had been searching for Rose, following her trail, knowing that she would be trying to expose Davies, to complete their mission. Rose embraced him, her tears flowing freely, her relief overwhelming. She had found him again, against all odds. He was alive. He was with her, and they were not alone. But even as they held each other, they knew their struggle was far from over. Davies was still out there, still powerful, still determined to silence them. Thomas, looking into Rose's eyes, saw the scars of her ordeal, the marks of betrayal, of loss, of fear. He knew that the war, the real war, had left wounds that would never fully heal, scars that would forever remain. But he also saw something else in her eyes, a strength, a resilience, a determination that had not been extinguished. She had been through hell, but she had not been broken. "We'll finish this, Rose," he said, his voice firm and resolute. "Together, we'll expose Davies, we'll bring him to justice. We'll have our future." Their reunion, a beacon of hope in the darkness, was tempered by the knowledge of the challenges that lay ahead. But they were together, and in that, they found the strength to face whatever the future held. The scars of war, both visible and invisible, would forever bind them, a reminder of the price of loyalty, the cost of freedom. But they would endure. They would heal. They would find their way back to the light. Chapter 18. The Unsent Letter. Thomas's miraculous reappearance had breathed new life into their desperate fight, but the situation remained perilous. Davies controlled the narrative, the police were searching for them, and the evidence was still in Rose's possession, a ticking time bomb that could either expose Davies or lead to their destruction. They found temporary refuge in a small, abandoned church, its stained glass windows shattered, its pews dusty and broken, a forgotten sanctuary in the heart of a war-torn city. The silence, broken only by the distant rumble of traffic and the occasional siren, provided a strange, almost surreal, calm. Thomas, despite his escape, bore the marks of his ordeal. He was bruised and battered, his clothes torn and blood-stained, his body weary, but his spirit remained unbroken. He had survived, driven by his love for Rose, by his determination to expose Davies, by his unwavering belief in justice. As they huddled together in the cold, damp church, Rose tended to his wounds, her touch gentle and reassuring, her heart aching with a mixture of relief and sorrow. She had seen so much suffering, so much pain, but seeing Thomas injured, vulnerable, affected her in a way she had never experienced before. "How did you escape, Thomas?" Rose asked, her voice soft, her eyes searching his. Thomas recounted his harrowing escape, his desperate flight through the streets of London, his close encounters with Davies's men, his reliance on his training, his instincts, his sheer will to survive. He had been captured, interrogated, tortured, but he had not broken. He had not revealed Rose's location. He had not betrayed their mission. He had held on to the hope of seeing her again, of completing their task, of finding a future together. As he spoke, Rose noticed a small, crumpled piece of paper clutched in his hand. It was a letter, addressed in his familiar handwriting, but it was stained with blood and dirt, its edges torn and frayed. "What's that, Thomas?" Rose asked, her curiosity piqued. Thomas hesitated, his gaze shifting away from hers. "It's a letter," he said, his voice low. "A letter I wrote to you. When I thought I wouldn't make it." Rose's heart ached. It was an unsent letter, a message from the brink of death, a testament to his love, his despair, his final thoughts. She reached for the letter, her fingers trembling. Can I read it?" Thomas nodded, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and resignation. He handed her the letter, his hand brushing against hers, a silent connection that spoke volumes. Rose unfolded the crumpled paper, her eyes scanning the familiar handwriting, the words blurred by bloodstains and tears. "My dearest Rose, if you are reading this, then I have failed. I have been captured, and I fear I will not survive. Davies is too powerful, his reach too extensive. He will stop at nothing to silence us. I write this letter with a heavy heart, filled with regret and sorrow. I regret that I brought you into this dangerous world, that I exposed you to such risks. I regret that I will not be able to fulfill the promises I made to you, the dreams we shared. But most of all, I regret that I will not be able to spend my life with you. You are the light of my life, Rose, the reason I fight, the reason I endure. You have shown me the true meaning of love, of courage, of resilience. Know this, my love. Even in death, I will be with you. My spirit will live on, in your heart, in your memories, in the future we will never share. Do not despair, Rose. Do not give up hope. Fight for justice. Fight for truth. Fight for the future we dreamed of. Expose Davies, avenge those he has wronged, and build a better world, a world free from the shadows of war and betrayal. I love you, Rose. I will always love you, until the end of time. Yours eternally, Thomas. Rose finished reading the letter, her tears flowing freely, her heart breaking with a mixture of grief and love. It was a testament to Thomas's unwavering devotion, his selfless sacrifice, his enduring love. She looked at Thomas, her eyes filled with tears, her voice choked with emotion. "Oh, Thomas," she whispered. I don't know what to say." Thomas reached out and gently wiped away her tears, his touch tender and reassuring. "You don't have to say anything, Rose," he said. "Just know that I meant every word. I love you, more than life itself." They embraced, holding each other tightly, their love a beacon of hope in the darkness, a bond that transcended death and despair. They had found their way back to each other, against all odds, and they would face whatever the future held, together. The unsent letter, a testament to their love, a symbol of their struggle, would forever remain a reminder of the price of loyalty, the cost of freedom, the enduring power of the human spirit. It was a scar that would never fully heal, but it was also a source of strength, a reason to keep fighting, a promise to keep. They were to proceed with Arthur's original plan. Chapter 19. A Glimmer of Hope. With Thomas's return, a renewed sense of purpose, though tinged with the bitter knowledge of their precarious situation, filled them. They decided to proceed with Arthur's original plan, delivering the evidence to Lord Ashworth. It was a gamble, a desperate throw of the dice, but it was their only remaining option. Thomas, still recovering from his injuries, insisted on accompanying Rose. He wouldn't let her face this danger alone, not again. They knew the risks, the ever-present threat of Davies's reach, but they were united in their determination to expose him, to bring him to justice. They spent the night in the abandoned church, planning their strategy, preparing for every contingency. They knew Davies would be expecting them to contact Lord Ashworth, that he would be watching, waiting, ready to intercept them. They decided to use a different approach, a more indirect route, to avoid Davies's surveillance. They would not go directly to Lord Ashworth's office, as Arthur had originally planned. Instead, they would use a network of messengers, trusted contacts within the Houses of Parliament, to deliver the evidence discreetly, bypassing Davies's watchful eyes. Thomas, drawing on his intelligence training, identified a series of individuals, clerks, secretaries, and minor officials who were known to be sympathetic to Lord Ashworth's cause, individuals who could be trusted to deliver a message, a package, without arousing suspicion. It was a complex, intricate plan, a chain of communication that relied on precise timing and unwavering discretion. One wrong move, one misplaced trust, could break the chain, exposing them all. The following morning, under the cover of a dense London fog, they left the church, their hearts pounding with a mixture of fear and anticipation. They moved separately, cautiously, their every step shadowed by danger. Thomas, disguised as a messenger, made his way to the Houses of Parliament, carrying a carefully concealed package containing a portion of the evidence. He would deliver the package to the first link in the chain, a clerk in the records office, who would then pass it on to the next contact, and so on until it reached Lord Ashworth's desk. Rose, dressed as a secretary, would remain nearby, monitoring the situation, ready to intervene if necessary. She would maintain communication with Thomas through a series of pre-arranged signals, a subtle code that would alert them to any danger. The plan unfolded with agonizing slowness, each step fraught with tension, each encounter a potential trap. Thomas, using his skills of deception and evasion, navigated the labyrinthine corridors of the Houses of Parliament, his senses on high alert, his every move calculated. He delivered the package to the first contact, a nervous, hesitant clerk who accepted the package with trembling hands. The clerk then passed it on to the next contact, a secretary in the Foreign Office, who slipped it into a secure pouch, ready for delivery to the next link in the chain. The evidence moved slowly, steadily, through the hidden channels of power, a secret message passing from hand to hand, a silent rebellion against Davies's tyranny. Rose, watching from a distance, felt a growing sense of hope, a glimmer of light in the darkness. The plan was working, the evidence was moving, they were one step closer to exposing Davies. But as the hours passed, a sense of unease began to creep into her mind. She hadn't heard from Thomas, the pre-arranged signals had not been given, and the silence was unsettling. She knew something was wrong. She decided to take a risk, to enter the Houses of Parliament, to find Thomas, to ensure he was safe. She disguised herself as a cleaner, using a borrowed uniform and a forged identity card, and slipped past the security guards, her heart pounding with fear. She made her way through the crowded corridors, her eyes scanning the faces, searching for Thomas, her senses on high alert. She reached the office where Thomas was supposed to have made the final delivery, the office of Lord Ashworth's secretary. The door was ajar, and she could hear voices, muffled and tense, coming from within. She cautiously peered inside. She saw Thomas, standing before Lord Ashworth's secretary, his face pale and drawn, his hands empty. The package, the evidence, was gone. And standing beside the secretary, his face a mask of triumph, was Colonel Davies. Rose's heart sank. They had been betrayed again. Someone within their chain of contacts, someone they had trusted, had leaked their plan to Davies. Davies smiled, a cold, cruel smile that sent a shiver down Rose's spine. "Well, well, well," he said, his voice smooth and menacing. "Look who we have here. Miss Kensington. And Captain Sinclair. It seems your little game is over." Rose knew they were trapped. They had been outmaneuvered, outsmarted, defeated. Davies had won. But even in the face of defeat, a spark of defiance, a flicker of hope, remained. They had faced death and betrayal, they had endured suffering and loss, but they had not been broken. They would not surrender. As Davies's men moved to arrest them, Rose looked at Thomas, her eyes filled with a mixture of love and determination. They would face this together, as they had faced everything else. They would not go down without a fight. Even in the face of overwhelming odds, a sliver of hope remained. Lord Ashworth had yet to arrive. Perhaps, just perhaps. Chapter 20. The Reckoning of Love and Duty. The scene in Lord Ashworth's secretary's office was a tableau of defeat. Rose and Thomas stood cornered, Davies's smug face a testament to their apparent failure. The evidence, their last hope, was gone, seemingly vanished into thin air. "It seems you underestimated me, Captain Sinclair," Davies sneered, his voice dripping with arrogance. "I have eyes and ears everywhere. Your little network of informants was no match for my reach." Thomas stood defiant, his gaze unwavering. "You may have won this battle, Davies, but you haven't won the war. The truth will come out. You will be exposed." Davies laughed, a cold, mirthless sound that echoed through the room. "The truth? My dear Captain, I control the truth. I control the narrative. And you, and Miss Kensington, will simply disappear. Another casualty of war. A tragic accident, perhaps.
Or a suicide pact.
The possibilities are endless." As Davies's men moved to seize them, a voice, strong and authoritative, boomed from the doorway. "Hold." Everyone turned to see Lord Ashworth, a tall, imposing figure with a stern face and piercing eyes, standing in the doorway. He had arrived, just in the nick of time. Davies's face paled, his smug expression replaced by a look of shock and apprehension. He had not expected Ashworth to arrive so soon. "Lord Ashworth," Davies stammered, trying to regain his composure. "This is a misunderstanding. These two are spies. Traitors." "I was just about to silence," Ashworth thundered, his voice cutting through Davies's lies. "I know exactly who these two are, Colonel. And I know exactly what you've been up to." He turned to Rose and Thomas, his gaze softening slightly. "Captain Sinclair. Miss Kensington. I believe you have something for me?" Rose, her heart filled with a surge of relief, stepped forward. "Yes, my lord," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "We have evidence. Evidence of Colonel Davies's treachery." She reached into her pocket, but her hand came up empty. The book. It was gone. She had it moments ago, she was certain. Panic surged through her. Had she dropped it? Had Davies's men taken it during the scuffle? Then she saw it. Lying on the secretary's desk, in plain sight, was the leather-bound book, Rebecca's meticulous record of Davies's crimes. But how? She hadn't placed it there. She had been holding it, clutching it tightly. She looked at Thomas, her eyes filled with confusion. He shook his head slightly, a subtle gesture that told her he didn't know either. Lord Ashworth picked up the book, his eyes scanning the pages, his expression growing increasingly grim. He looked up, his gaze fixed on Davies, his voice filled with cold fury. "This is damning, Colonel," he said. "This is treason. You will be arrested, court-martialed, and hanged." Davies, his face ashen, his composure shattered, tried to protest, to deny the accusations, but his words were drowned out by Ashworth's commanding voice. "Take him away," Ashworth ordered, gesturing to his own guards, who had entered the room behind him. Davies's men, realizing that their leader had been exposed, that their power had vanished, hesitated, their loyalty wavering. They looked at Davies, then at Ashworth, their faces filled with confusion and fear. Ashworth's guards, loyal and disciplined, stepped forward, seizing Davies, disarming him, and dragging him from the room. His protests, his pleas, his threats, faded into silence as he was led away. The room was silent, the tension broken, the thread extinguished. Rose and Thomas stood there, stunned, relieved, but also deeply confused. Who had placed the book on the desk? Who had saved them? Then Rose saw her. Standing in the shadows near the doorway, her face partially hidden, was Rebecca Kincaid. She had followed them, she had stayed hidden, and she had, at the crucial moment, placed the evidence where it would be found. She had saved them. Rebecca smiled, a faint, sad smile that spoke volumes of her sacrifice, her redemption, her unwavering loyalty. And then, as quickly as she had appeared, she vanished, disappearing back into the shadows. Lord Ashworth turned to Rose and Thomas, his expression softening. "You two have been through a great deal," he said. "You have shown remarkable courage, remarkable resilience. You have served your country well." He paused, his gaze sweeping over them. "I will ensure that your story is told, that your sacrifices are recognized, that justice is served." Rose and Thomas, their hearts filled with gratitude and relief, thanked Lord Ashworth for his intervention, for his belief in them, for his commitment to justice. Their ordeal was over. Davies had been exposed, his reign of terror brought to an end. They had survived. They had won. But the victory was bittersweet, tempered by the loss of Finch, by the betrayal of Silas, by the scars of war that would forever remain. They had fought for love, for duty, for justice, and they had paid a heavy price. But they had also found something precious, something enduring, a love that had survived the crucible of war, a bond that had been forged in the fires of adversity. As they left the Houses of Parliament, hand in hand, the London fog swirling around them, they knew their lives would never be the same. They had been changed, transformed by their experiences. But they were together, and in that, they found the strength to face the future, to rebuild their lives, to honor the memory of those they had lost, to create a world free from the shadows of war and betrayal. The reckoning of love and duty had been harsh, but it had also revealed the enduring power of the human spirit, the unwavering strength of love, the unbreakable bonds of loyalty. Epilogue. The years that followed the war were a time of healing, of rebuilding, of remembering. Rose and Thomas, their lives forever intertwined by their shared ordeal, returned to a semblance of normalcy, but the scars of their past remained, a constant reminder of the price they had paid for freedom, for justice, for love. They were married in a quiet ceremony at St. Michael's, the same churchyard where Thomas's false grave had once stood, a symbol of their resurrection, their rebirth, their enduring love. Only a few close friends and family attended, including Margaret, Elsie, and, surprisingly, Arthur, who had proven to be a steadfast ally, his initial nervousness replaced by a quiet confidence born of his role in their triumph. Rebecca Kincaid, her whereabouts unknown, had vanished into the shadows, her sacrifice a silent testament to her courage, her redemption. She had left a note for Rose and Thomas, a brief, poignant message of gratitude and farewell, a final act of loyalty from a woman who had been both a friend and a foe. Thomas, his health gradually restored, left the world of intelligence, dedicating his life to helping other veterans, those who had suffered the physical and emotional wounds of war. He understood their pain, their struggles, their need for healing, and he became a beacon of hope, a symbol of resilience, a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit. Rose continued her work as a nurse, her compassion and empathy deepened by her own experiences. She tended to the wounded, the sick, the dying, her gentle touch, her understanding heart, bringing comfort and solace to those in need. She became known for her unwavering dedication, her selfless service, her ability to see beyond the scars, to touch the souls of those who had been broken by war. They settled in a small cottage in the countryside, far from the noise and chaos of London, a haven of peace and tranquility. They created a life together, a life filled with love, with laughter, with shared memories, but also with a quiet understanding of the fragility of life, the preciousness of each moment. They never forgot those they had lost. Finch, Silas, whose betrayal remained a source of pain and bewilderment, and all the countless others who had fallen victim to Davies's treachery. They honored their memory. They kept their stories alive. They ensured that their sacrifices would not be in vain. Years later, Rose would often visit St. Michael's. But now, she visited 2 graves. One was Thomas's, his real one this time. He had lived a long and full life, but eventually, time had claimed him, as it claims us all. The other was a simple stone, marked only with the initials RK. It was a tribute to Rebecca Kincaid, a woman who had lived in the shadows, a woman who had been both a victim and a hero, a woman who had ultimately chosen loyalty and sacrifice over self-preservation. Rose never knew if Rebecca was truly buried there, or if it was simply a symbolic gesture, a way of honoring a woman who had vanished without a trace. But every Sunday, Rose would bring flowers to both graves, a silent tribute to the 2 people who had shaped her life, who had taught her the true meaning of love, of courage, of resilience. And as she stood there, in the quiet solitude of the churchyard, she would remember the darkness, the danger, the despair, but also the hope, the love, the triumph that had emerged from the ashes of war. She had lived a long and full life, a life marked by both sorrow and joy, by loss and love, by the enduring scars of war and the unbreakable bonds of loyalty. And as she looked back, she knew that she had done what she had to do, that she had fought for what she believed in, that she had loved with all her heart. And that, she realized, was all that truly mattered. The end.